The first details are emerging from a widely anticipated book, the product of Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward, of course, one half of Woodward and Bernstein, brought us Watergate, among other things. Bob Woodward, who maintains a title at the Washington Post. And this piece of work by our friends Phil Rucker and Robert Costa hit while we were on the air. Bob Woodward's new book reveals a nervous breakdown of Trump's presidency. So who better to talk to but their national political correspondent Robert Costa, also happens to be host of Washington Week on PBS. Bob, I know it's a lot, and I know it's a piece of work you've been able to read and subsume, but walk us through what you believe will be the headlines when this book lands and is read by everybody.
Woodward uses the book uses the phrase nervous breakdown. He talks about an administrative coup d'etat. The book is full of scenes, vivid scenes about top advisors to President Trump plucking papers off of his desk, trade agreements, foreign policy decisions, to try to keep the president away from making decisions they find alarming or unhelpful to U.S. trade policy or foreign policy. And you have all these people around the president constantly over the last year or so doing things on their own to try to stop President Trump.
Bob, I've read already on social media certain people saying half-heartedly to expect a purge at the White House because part of Woodward's method, there are people on the record, there are people putting their name alongside quotes, alongside information that the author gathered. This won't do a lot for the stock of some of the people on the payroll in the West Wing.
The coming days, Brian, are going to be very revealing about how this administration is going to handle the book. The book was written on what's called deep background, which means people spoke to Bob Woodward, provided him with documents, dates, calendars. It's clear throughout the book that Woodward has been pretty meticulous in nailing down the dates, the hours of different conversations and exchanges. But the attribution is deep background, meaning it's not always directly attributed, a lot of these quotes and scenes, but they're provided by key players who participated or have firsthand knowledge of these scenes and of these moments. And it's a portrait of the Trump presidency, of a president who's at odds with his own aides all of the time, calling them names, and then his own advisors calling the president names. Secretary of Defense Mattis, in particular, comes across as someone who is privately critical of the president. What he says in response to this book will be interesting.
There's a scene recounted in your work, summary of the book, where the president, in effect, orders the assassination of Bashar al-Assad of Syria, and it's quickly and completely ignored by his defense secretary.
You have the president telling Mattis and other defense officials, go after Assad in Syria, kill him, an assassination order in a sense, and Mattis saying we're not going to do that. There's another scene with Mattis talking to the president about the late Senator John McCain, who was then alive. The president, according to Woodward's account, says McCain was a coward and accepted early release from Vietnam. Mattis corrects him and says that is incorrect, sir, and the president kind of brushes off that response. These scenes are just full all over the book about people having these kind of exchanges with the president, and it's all based on Woodward's reporting at this time.
Also, you mentioned this, between what the president calls employees of his, members of his administration, and what those around the president call him, you kind of have to keep reminding yourself this is the president of the United States and the West Wing and cabinet we're talking about here.
It is a bleak portrait provided by Bob Woodward. You see an administration that's struggling to contain and guide their own president, reluctant to say anything publicly, but privately going so far as to take trade agreements off of his desk, to pull back on some of his foreign policy missions. They're trying to teach him about world affairs. There's a scene inside of the Pentagon where they try to take the president around the world, and the whole scene falls apart as the generals and others in the military fail to convince the president about world order concern about U.S. alliances abroad. And you see a president isolated, a president who's also fuming constantly about the Russia investigation. Scenes with his former attorney John Dowd, with the president saying, "I really don't want to testify," after going through an arduous practice session. And the president continues to say publicly he wants to testify. And so these scenes cut at the core of what some of the president has said publicly. And he has yet to respond, but knowing the president, he surely will.
Robert Costa from the newsroom of The Washington Post, as everyone reacts to the reporting inside this new book by Bob Woodward, who has confirmed to NBC News all of the substance and on-the-record quotes contained in this Washington Post piece. Kristen Welker over at the White House. An interesting place to be, I would assume, today. Kristen?
It is, Brian, and no response yet from White House officials. Let me paint the scene for you here. At last check, a number of officials were huddled in the office of Sarah Huckabee Sanders. That was before this bombshell came out. Now, were they discussing the hearings on Capitol Hill? Was it a pre-planned meeting? We don't know. As you know from your time covering the White House, there are often meetings here throughout the day. One thing is certain, they had their eyes trained on those fireworks on Capitol Hill, and now on these bombshell revelations. They surely knew that this book, that these excerpts were going to come out. They are undoubtedly trying to craft their response. So I expect we will get something from them in short order, if not a presidential tweet. What is so striking to me, Brian, though, about these excerpts that we've read so far in Bob Woodward's book is that to some extent they sort of connect the dots of so much of the reporting that we have done here since the first days of this administration. The tone and the tenor really echo the discord and at times chaos that we witnessed here. Remember, NBC News reported that John Kelly referred to the president as an idiot several months ago. We also reported that his Secretary of State referred to him as a moron. And then some months after that, of course, we saw the ouster of his first Secretary of State. So it's wholly consistent with, I think, so much of our reporting, and specifically surrounding the idea of a presidential interview. In conversations with the president's attorney, they have been very concerned about him sitting down with special counsel Robert Mueller for this very reason, out of concern that he might perjure himself. And what we see in Woodward's book is really a further exploration as to why they have so many concerns. And I want to go back to a point that you just raised. Will we see some wholesale purge here at the White House? My money, Brian, is that we won't likely see a purge. Will we see some departures? That is certainly possible. But this president seems to, in his second year, really want to project an air of stability beyond that initial chaos that we all witnessed. And I point you to his chief of staff, John Kelly. Not only is he still here, but the White House recently announcing that he plans to stay through the end of the term. So that is significant. It's a significant development. And I think that it shows this president is loath to sort of cut people off. Is he going to sideline his chief of staff? Has he already done that? By all accounts, he has. Will that happen to some of the people who've been quoted in this book? That is very possible. So we'll be tracking all of that. Still no briefing on this schedule, Brian. The president has an event at 1:30. We're hoping they open that up to reporters so we can ask him a few questions.